general. The telegram said, we want you to stop publication immediately, and if you don't, we're going to take appropriate action. I mean, what in God's name have we been fighting for in this country for 200 or 300 years, to have the right to speak and the right to publish, the right to think against a threat by the government, if all we're going to do is give it all up because someone sends you a telegram?
Now listen here, printing top secret information. I don't care how they feel about the war, whether they're for it or against it. You can or should not do it. It's an attack on the integrity of government. And by God, I'm going to fight that son of a bitching paper. They don't know what's going to hit them now, though.
A federal court has ordered the New York Times to stop publication temporarily. The government asked for and got an injunction against the Times.
Before the Nixon administration enjoined the New York Times, there had never been another injunction brought against a media company in a federal court.
A name has now come out as the possible source of the Times Pentagon documents. It is that of Daniel Ellsberg, 40 years old, one-time Marine, later a top policy analyst for the Defense and State Departments during the Vietnam buildup.
There was no sign of Professor Ellsberg or his family at their home in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
And we're looking on the television, the morning news, and we notice that the FBI is at our little apartment in Cambridge. And we say we can't go back. We go to a motel for a couple of nights under false names. We don't have any clothes, we don't have a toothbrush, we don't have anything.
He knew they'd be looking for him. He knew they'd be looking to arrest him. And he wanted to have an opportunity to give the papers to more newspapers.
I came out of a 3 o'clock meeting the day after the Times had been enjoined, and my deputy said, maybe you better look at this. I dialed a number, and a voice said, if I can get you what you want, will you print them? I said, damn well we'll print them.
The Post picked up the Pentagon story where the Times left off, but was ordered to halt its publication of the material in the court ruling last night.
There was no way of knowing when the New York Times and Washington Post could resume publication of the papers, if at all. This could be the end unless other newspapers were willing to defy the government. I had heard that Senator Mike Gravel would do a daily filibuster until the draft expired.
Well, I'm just chugging along with my filibuster, and I get a phone call, and I don't know who it is. He says immediately, is this Senator Gravel? I said, yes, it is. He says, would you read the Pentagon Papers as part of your filibuster? I said, yes. Now, please hang up.
As I put it to him over the phone, if you're really going to do a filibuster, I can give you material that'll keep you busy reading until Christmas.
The person who physically gave me the papers was Ben Begdikian. He was the editor at the Washington Post.
He's a junior senator, and he's from Alaska, and that doesn't carry much weight. So he was, I think, chair of the Building and Grounds Committee.
So we meet, and I want to be a little secretive, so we're meeting outside the Senate chambers in the columns next to the Capitol. Lo and behold, Bob Dole comes out. And Dole sees me, and he has something to say to me, so he comes over. So Ben slips behind the column, and I try to dismiss Dole real quick. And then I go back to Ben. He's going to get the papers to me in some faraway, dark corner of maybe Rock Creek Park. I always said, Ben, that's not the way we're going to do it. At midnight, under the marquee of the Mayflower Hotel, you'll park your car there. I will come up next with my car. I'll get out. You open the trunk of your car, and I'll open the trunk of my car.
I drive down in my Karmann Kia, and he's got a couple of aides there, and I said, this is heavy, you may want your aides to carry it. He said, no, I have immunity and they don't.
We transfer the papers to me just like that in seconds, and I speed away.
While I was still underground, I was contacted by the most trusted man in America.
Good evening. Daniel Ellsberg, a former State Department and Pentagon planner, and of late something of a phantom figure, agreed today to be interviewed at a secret location. I asked him what he considers the most important revelations to date from the Pentagon documents.
I think the lesson is that the people of this country can't afford to let the president run the country by himself. without the help of the Congress, without the help of the public.
Dan does this interview, which comes out on CBS, nationwide television, as the biggest FBI manhunt since the Lindbergh kidnapping is going on looking for us. But we still hadn't given out enough of the papers.
Today, another lid broke loose. The Boston Globe began its series based on presumably classified government documents.
The Chicago Sun-Times entered the drama today by running a story which says that the Kennedy administration...
Today, the 11 night newspapers and the Los Angeles Times joined the procession.
The ball game was over. Any effort at suppressing the Pentagon Papers was going to fail. Dan and his network had distributed portions of the Pentagon Papers to 17 different organizations.
They couldn't stop them. As one of the lawyers said, it was like herding bees.
The press said, we can look at this, we can make a valid judgment about what serves national security, and we can be and will be independent from our government. And that was a declaration of independence, and it really changed the relationship between the government and the media ever since.
The Pentagon Papers story was on the nightly news, the first 7 or 8 minutes of the nightly news every night for 2 weeks.
So that gave it as much public attention as I could possibly ask for.
We were underground, so we were able to watch the news day and night. And this thing was unfolding in the most dramatic way.
Alaska's 41-year-old Democratic Senator Mike Gravel held a mock meeting of his subcommittee on buildings and grounds with only himself present and began reading aloud the 7,000-page Pentagon secret report in public.
The papers prove that for 20 years, we have been victims of our Southeast Asia policy.
I was frightened to death over releasing the Pentagon Papers. I had no idea whether I was going to prison. All I could think of was, my country is killing people, we're maiming Americans, and this is terrible. And so I was overcome with emotion, not patriotism, just emotion of something you love dearly that has gone astray.
He continued until exhaustion and emotion overcame him after 1 o'clock this morning.
I collected myself and I asked, now keep in mind, I'm the only one on the committee. I asked unanimous consent to put all of these papers into the record, and I've got the gavel and I slam it and I say, hearing no objection, so ordered, that's it, papers are out. They're in the Senate record.
Can you stop? Slow down.
Even if the FBI had wanted to arrest him outside the courthouse this morning, they probably couldn't have done it. Ellsberg was walled off by newsmen and supporters as he admitted that he was indeed the man who brought the Pentagon Papers to the press and congressional leaders.
I did this clearly at my own jeopardy, and I am prepared to answer to all the consequences of these decisions.
Dr. Ellsberg, you have any concern about the possibility of going to prison for this? We have a quick
back. Wouldn't you go to prison to sell this war?
In one of the most important judicial decisions in the history of the country, the Supreme Court today ruled that the New York Times and the Washington Post may continue to publish the secret Pentagon Papers.
The ruling was amazingly simple. It was that proving the need for prior censorship is a heavy burden, and the government didn't meet that burden.
The decision was a great one. The story today is what the Constitution of this country means to us. I've never appreciated what the meaning and importance of separation of powers is so much as in the last week.
Were you surprised at how
When Dan Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers, he was doing it to stop the war. Perhaps the most important legacy he left us with, though, was a Supreme Court case, the Pentagon Papers case, which is perhaps the most important First Amendment decision in the court's history. I can guarantee you that every day there's a First Amendment lawyer out there citing the Pentagon Papers case in order to protect free speech and free press against government encroachment.
When we finally won the right to continue publication from the Supreme Court,
This was a firm ruling that national security alone, the cry of national security, does not justify censorship in advance.
I wanted to tell you that I was so damn mad when that Supreme Court had to come down. First, I didn't like their decision, but unbelievable, wasn't it?
It was unbelievable.
You know, those clowns we got on there, I'll tell you, I hope I outlive the bastards.
Persons close to the president vehemently deny that he is in any vengeful mood toward the New York Times or any other newspaper, as for fears expressed by reporters and editors that there is big trouble ahead from the administration. The Nixon men say that is pure paranoia. Ridiculous.
Mr. Ellsberg, or Dr. Ellsberg himself, has been hailed as a hero by a lot of people, condemned as a traitor by others. We welcome, please, the man who made the whole thing possible, Dr. Daniel Ellsberg.
I think that the drama that surrounded the release of the papers, which centered on the personality and experience of Dan Ellsberg himself, gave the papers a prominence that they probably wouldn't have had a grayer personality been associated with this release.
That much applause without even doing a monologue? That's amazing. Is there any way to answer in 30 seconds what people can do?
I think one thing that people will conclude when they read it is that they have not asked enough. They have not expected enough or demanded enough in the way of boldness, in the way of responsibility from their public servants. Make that known, and I think that our Constitution will continue to function better than it has been in the past.
I think he did betray a trust, and he put in jeopardy not only his welfare, but that of everybody else who was involved.
There was no question in my mind that my best friend, really, Harry Rowan, would be definitely associated with what I'd done. And the fact that I did it while he was president, that this happened, this security breach happened. So I knew that would hurt him, might lose him his job, as it did, actually. E.M. Forster said, if I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying a friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country. And I remember when that was quoted to me, my reaction right away was, I don't agree with that at all. We're talking about many, many, many lives here. We're talking about shortening a war.
Not long after the release of the Pentagon Papers, I was at a conference at UCLA. There were at least a dozen people from Rand at that conference, and not one of them would shake hands with Dan. Not one would sit near him. They treated him as a traitor. And whether they meant a traitor to his country or a traitor to his organization, it's hard to know.
I was Typhoid Mary. I was a leper with a bell around my neck. I've come to realize the fear of being cut out from the group of people you respect and whose respect you want and normally expect. That keeps people participating in anything, no matter how terrible.
Whatever his intentions may have been, in your opinion, did Daniel Ellsberg betray his country?
I would put it another way. Daniel Ellsberg, whatever his intentions, gave aid and comfort to the enemy. And under those circumstances, that is inexcusable. After all, he is putting himself above the President of the United States, above the Congress, above our whole system of government, when he says, in effect, that he would determine what should be made public.
I think that there is probably some good justification for the strong feelings Nixon had. He would make a decision in the National Security Council and the next day read it on the front page of the New York Times or some other newspaper. This makes it virtually impossible to govern.
Just because some guy's going to be a martyr, we can't be in a position of allowing the fellow to get away with this kind of wholesale thievery, or otherwise it's going to happen all over the government. I just say that we've got to keep our eye on the main ball. The main ball's Ellsberg. We got to get this son of a bitch.
The leak of the Pentagon Papers changed the Nixon White House. It really is what some of us have called the beginning of the dark period. I mean, it was rough and tumble before, but it got down and dirty. So it's really a defining event for the Nixon presidency. And this is when Eagle Krogh, Bud Krogh, was selected to head up the so-called Plumbers Unit.
I was summoned to the Oval Office by the president. John Ehrlichman and I met with him. There was some suspicion that Dr. Ellsberg had access to the more recent war plans that had been developed by the Nixon administration and would be able to release those documents. I came from that meeting feeling very strongly that I was dealing with a national security crisis and I was to take any means necessary to respond to it.
The difficulty is that all the good lawyers always say, well, we've got to win the court case, prove the court case, but to convict the son of a bitch in the press. That's the way it's done.
The president had decided to set up a special investigations unit in the White House staff.
You've got to get a better team. There's one guy on the outside. He's hard as nails. His name is Howard Hunt. I need to do it, and I'll direct it myself. And I play it gloves off. Now, goddammit, get it going on.
Did Daniel Ellsberg work alone? Was he working with some other people? Was it part of a conspiracy? And it was in that context that a proposal was made by E. Howard Hunt to get information that could be used to discredit Dr. Ellsberg. A covert operation ought to be undertaken to examine all of the files still held by Dr. Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Dr. Lewis Fielding. This went to John Ehrlichman. Underneath that proposal were two lines, approve of the line, disapprove of the line. He wrote his large E after approve, and then put in, under your assurance, it is not traceable.
The FBI came one day and said, I'm afraid we have a subpoena here for you to testify today at the grand jury. My father was very upset. He somehow thought that there was something more that my mother could do to prevent this somehow, if she had better legal advice or whatever her attitude was. So you're the one who got him into this. Of course, he's gonna just tell the truth. And my father said, well, of course, you've got to just tell the truth. My personal involvement in the whole thing, the people I knew about, and the copying of the Pentagon Papers, that became the focus of the indictment.
I have a statement. I have a prepared statement that I'd like to read.
Well, I said to myself that I would not testify against him.
Let me put my cigarette out.
Because after all, to begin with, I had urged him to do it.
The Attorney General offers me the alternative of collaborating with him in his attempt to prosecute Daniel Ellsberg by testifying in secret before a grand jury. For me, that is no choice.
He was immediately put in custody for contempt of court. He offended the prosecutorial team by refusing to cooperate in any way in the grand jury. If Tony had testified, he would have been out scot-free.
The first thing that came to my mind was Gandhi's dictum, you should not cooperate with evil.
The Pentagon Papers drama changed abruptly into the Pentagon Papers media freakout and cameraman's farce as the documents arrived at the Senate.
I think Dan was disappointed in that he may have expected too much from the publication of the papers. He may have expected that the publication of the papers would create a greater sensation than it did. Of course, it created a sensation.
Where is Mr. Ellsberg?
I hope he's in the jail.
But I think he was disappointed in the fact that the substance of the papers, the content of the papers, did not seem to be absorbed by the public.
I gave up my job, my career, my clearance, and I staked my freedom on a gamble. If the American people knew the truth about how they had been lied to, about the myths that had led them to endorse this butchery for 25 years, that they would choose against it. And the risk that you take when you do that is that you'll learn something ultimately about your fellow citizens that you won't like to hear. And that is that they hear it, they learn from it, they understand it, and they proceed to ignore it.
I still think we ought to take the dikes off now. I think to let drown people get drowned out. Well, no, I'd rather use a nuclear bomb if you got a nuclear bomb, no problem. I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake.
I remember speaking about a year ago and expressing the hope that we would end this war before we had dropped another 1 million tons of bombs on the Vietnamese. Well, that hope has been disappointed.
We could never get into the paper the very fact that we had reported the bombing tonnage. They didn't even go so far as to say, the Ellsbergs have this funny habit in every daily press conference of saying, here's how many bombs we dropped last week.
We've dropped another 200,000 tons of bombs on Indochina. That's 10 Hiroshimas. 1 Hiroshima a week.
They never even mentioned we'd said it, let alone reflect on the fact that it was happening. When I knew we were going to bomb Vietnam forever, that was like bombing the neighborhood. The people there were more than pictures for me, and they were more than numbers.
When we went to select our jury, we brought in an expert, actually a psychiatrist. He told us we were defending 2 young men, bright, high achievers, men with a future, who were willing to risk it all for the sake of not themselves or their own careerist interests, but for the sake of a principle. And the psychiatrist said to us, you don't want on this jury men of middle age, because these are people who in the course of their lives might possibly have sacrificed principle for the sake of career, for the sake of family, and they lived with that compromise, and they will have a lot of disdain, even contempt, for 2 men who did it for the sake of principle and took the risk.
In Los Angeles today, Daniel Ellsberg returned to the witness stand in the Pentagon Papers case, and for the first time, the chief defendant spelled out how he changed from hawk to dove on the Vietnam War.
When I was on the stand for 4.5 days, I actually recalled this particular incident in 1966. When I came on a burning village, that it was burning because our Vietnamese troops had fired on it. And in the course of that, I saw some kids picking through the embers of their huts for a little plastic doll. That was extremely anguishing for me to see this sad appearance. This is what the war meant to them, really, the destruction of their homes and their lives.
At the Pentagon Papers trial in California today, it was revealed that the people who burglarized the Watergate also burglarized the office of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist.
Are you telling me that the break-in to Dr. Fielding's office was to satisfy the President of the United States?
The President wanted very much to make sure that a thing like this could not happen again.
At no time did anyone ask, is this the right thing to do? We never looked at either the legal issues, the ethical issues, the spiritual issues. None of those things came to the level of consciousness. It was a collapse of integrity of the first order.
The revelation in the trial of the Pentagon Papers that the White House had sent the plumbers to Los Angeles really, I think, broke open the Watergate scandal. And then to top it all off, if this story needed topping, the fact that the president met with the presiding judge.
The man presiding over the Ellsberg case, Judge Matthew Byrne, today confirmed that Ehrlichman had offered him the job of FBI director.
It didn't seem possible, but there were even more sensational developments today involving the White House. An admission from the Federal Bureau of Investigation that it had listened to Daniel Ellsberg on wiretaps as long as 2 years before he released the Pentagon Papers.
Good evening. A federal judge in Los Angeles today declared a mistrial in the Pentagon Papers case. He dismissed all the charges against Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo. The judge ruled that the government had so tainted its own case as to make a fair trial impossible.
A presidential prosecution that started, we now know, in order to help re-elect a president, and it's ending now, I think, to avoid impeaching that same president. But it won't stop that process because the facts, thanks in part to this trial, are out on the table. They're out of the safes, just as the Pentagon Papers are out of the safes, and they're the same kind of facts. And they can't be put back in the safes.
Son of a bitch thief is made a national hero and sending it off on a mistrial. The New York Times gets a Pulitzer Prize for stealing documents. We're trying to get at thieves. What in the name of God have you come to?
Because of what Dan did, and the overreaction of an imperial president, if you will, to what had happened, it changed history. It was the cover-up of the Ellsberg break-in that concerned the White House. And the seeds of all of Watergate occur in the Pentagon Papers.
The greatest result of what he did was to get President Nixon out of office. That wasn't, I'm sure, any part of his expectation or his intention.
What has remained significant about the release of the Pentagon Papers is the decision by a public official to give priority to conscience as compared to career.
The fact is that secrets can be held by men in the government whose careers have been spent learning how to keep their mouths shut. I was one of those.
If you have somebody who starts with such a background within government and who understands what Dan understands about how it works from the inside, and who then continues to speak out, constantly trying to unmask the lies and reveal the truth so that people can make honest, clear decisions about their own lives and about the life of our nation, the life of the world. He is the preeminent whistleblower in the very best and broadest and deepest sense.
We as a people do have that power, the power to change ourselves and history,
We are here today.
I think the resonance that I feel with Dan is that he is trying always to do what he thinks is the highest right under the circumstances, regardless of the consequences. I was not able to do that for when I worked in the government. I was too tied into the group I was working for. But Dan does that all the time. It's an amazing life, the way he has lived it over the last 30 years since all of those things occurred.
His act had an effect on him, a profound effect on him and on the rest of his life. He was never going to rest easy from that point on unless he was part of some movement against war and for social justice. So all these years since then, he has acted in the same spirit in which he revealed the papers to the nation.
The courage we need is not the courage, the fortitude to be obedient in the service of an unjust war, to help conceal lies, to do our job by a boss who has usurped power and is acting as an outlaw government. It is the courage at last to face honestly the truth and the reality of what we are doing in the world and act responsibly to change it.